All right, let me give this a sync. Sweet. Welcome to the Monkey Dance Podcast. This is Ohan, and we're back in the studio after a few months away. I was away doing research in Copenhagen, which hopefully we can talk about on the podcast soon. But there are a few great episodes lined up, so we'll be releasing a constant content every 2 weeks, basically, with a new interviewee over the next 3-4 months. So I'm pretty excited about that. And today, to start it off, we are sitting with Barbara.
Hi, I'm Barbora Valik.
And why don't we just start out with you and you tell us who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm a PhD candidate here at CEU, in particular at the Doctoral School of Political Science, International Relations and Public Policy. So it's quite a mouthful. And my research is very broadly located in peace and conflict studies, but more in particular, the research for the dissertation that I'm working on here at CEU has to do with the indigenous communities and with their choice of violence and non-violence. So the tactics that they choose to mobilize. And in very particular, I'm interested in the circumstances under which they resort to violent forms of mobilization.
Cool. And you're looking at specific countries when you do that?
I am indeed. So the fieldwork that I have done has been in Latin America, in Mexico, in Chile, and in Colombia. And I'm also using Guatemala as an additional case, but without having done fieldwork in this particular country. But it's indeed a comparative study. I look at these countries and conflicts within the countries as really a kind of cross-case study, but also longitudinally I go into the details of every country and look at how these movements developed within the country over time.
Yeah, right on. And do you want to start with that work specifically, or would you rather go into a trajectory of how you kind of got into that work specifically?
So we can do a little bit of both, I suppose. So when I originally really came to CEU, I was interested in studying conflicts and in particular the recurrence of conflicts. So I was really driven by this idea of let's see how we could perhaps make peace more stable. And then once I was here under the influence of a lot of great scholars in self-determination and nationalism, I got into making my topic a bit narrower in the sense that I started focusing on self-determination movements. And I was working on conflicts, particularly here in Europe. And as I was doing my fieldwork in Catalonia in the Basque Country, I also, it was kind of Spain a step away from Latin America. And I was wondering, Latin America is really a region where you don't hear very frequently about, separatist violence or secessionist conflicts. And I was wondering what kind of forms the self-determination struggles do you get over there. That's how I kind of got into researching the indigenous communities. Of course, as I later found out, there are also secessionist struggles in a way, like Antioquia in Colombia or Guayaquil in Ecuador. But these tend to be very different if we compare it to the self-determination struggles here in Europe, in the sense that they don't really get much of a ethnic basis, right? Like these are not groups of people that would be distinct from the majority population in a way. But who is culturally, ethnically distinct are the indigenous people. And then I was kind of interested in the question of why these struggles or conflicts that they have with the state do not really take the form of secessionist violence. Now, of course, what I will be saying will be really, sometimes to people who work on these topics might seem as swiping generalizations, right? Because there is a lot of difference among the indigenous movements in Latin America, and then also in each particular country, right? I will talk of indigenous movement in Colombia, let's say, but of course there are many different groups with many different opinions, and of course there might be, what I'm saying is trying to capture the general mood and the general trends, but of course there is a lot of nuance. But yeah, so practically that was the kind of journey that got me all the way to Latin America and to the indigenous struggles in particular. And I can, of course, talk more in detail about the demands that these groups tend to make from the point of view of the self-determination kind of literature or research, because that was one thing that I found particularly interesting. We get a lot of research in self-determination scholarship and in conflict and peace studies precisely on these conflicts that look at self-determination from the point of view of creating one own state, or do indeed maybe have also some autonomous kind of agenda, in the sense that maybe, okay, secession is not necessary, but we want just autonomy. But the indigenous conflicts were kind of left out of the scholarship and were not so much engaged with. So that's where I was wondering, okay, let's take a look at this particular subgroup and what's going on there, and particularly with the idea of the violent strategies, right? Because, and here we could get into an entire large discussion in peace and conflict studies about the grievance versus greed and opportunities for conflict. And of course, if we look at indigenous people in Latin America, the grievances are really widespread, right? They're usually the segments of the society that live in the most poverty, most discrimination, with least access to resources and so on. But at the same time, we have not seen indiscriminately in all the countries kind of violent mobilization of these indigenous movements. So I'm interested particularly in the circumstances under which the movements did resort to violence. Of course, here it's again important to say that even if a section of the movement chose to mobilize violently, this doesn't necessarily mean that suddenly the entire movement as such transitioned to violence. And usually non-violent forms of mobilization kind of coexist with one segment of the movement that might be violent. But it's really this segment that becomes the core of my interest.
And you have certain cases, of course, where indigenous groups who take up violence, or any resistance struggle that takes up violence, at some point might relinquish violence as a tool, and they might use that as a negotiating tactic. So the violence is almost to bring oneself to the table of discussion.
Of course, yeah, and that's one big topic also, in the sense that I'm not only interested in, and thank you for pointing that out, the contexts where the violence occurs, but also the contexts where the transition from violence to non-violence actually takes place. So these are like the two core research questions in the dissertation that I'm working on, that like one, the circumstances under which these movements resort to violence, and second, the circumstances where the transition from violence to non-violence occurs.
Right. And when we were speaking before, you had mentioned the methods that you're using and what you're trying to actually quantify in your research. So maybe we can kind of dip into that quickly to give people a framing for the discussion itself.
Of course. So the methodological view of causality that I take in my research is a little bit different from the majority of the studies, particularly the quantitative studies that we tend to see in peace and conflict studies, which really take the correlational view of causality, in the sense that, you know, the more of something we see, the more of something else we expect. So like, for instance, the more repression a state uses, the more conflict, you know, or the higher intensity of the conflict we would see. So this is not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is taking so-called, at least sometimes in social sciences, we refer to it as the set theoretic view of causality, where I really work with necessity and sufficiency, and the factors, we call them conditions, that might be necessary and sufficient for a certain outcome, in my case, resulting to violence and the transition to non-violence at some point.
Cool. So then can you give us some examples of how you operationalize this?
Sure. So in my case, in my particular research, when I really look at necessity, well, one thing that I already mentioned was the grievance, right? In a way, we could think of grievance as a necessary condition for everything else to unfold. But the problem with grievance in my own research really is that also when I look in the cases longitudinally, this is really something that stays in place, right? In my cases, it's more sort of, we could say, constant rather than a variable. So this is something that I'm trying to, I know that it's there, but I'm not including it in the core of the set theoretic model. In the model as such, the three core conditions that also change over time and seem to have explanatory power as to, you know, when the groups resort to violence and when they transform to non-violent, are the socialization, the group socialization. I will get in a second into what I mean by those terms. The regime type and the group leverage. So these would be the three conditions, core conditions that I'm looking at. First of all, group socialization. What I really talk about here are three forms of socialization that I distinguish in my research. with the first one of them practically taking place, we could view it as taking place on the international stage, right? So the group looking at movements abroad and the strategies they use and kind of selecting from these movements what they perceive is the closest to them. And so it's about the position, or overall, not just in this one case, but when we speak of socialization, it's about the positioning of the movement in like a wider family of struggles. This can take place on the international stage, but also internally within the country. So what we often see is that these groups will also look into the history of the country and other struggles that took place at different times. And then the last form of socialization can really happen with contemporary movements, but within one's own country. This is particularly in the context where really groups are surrounded by violence, which might not have indigenous root, or generally in the cases that I have kind of researched, it was not an indigenous root, but we can think of the case of Colombia, right, where the indigenous people are surrounded by violence coming from all sides, right? Be it the guerrillas, the paramilitaries, nowadays narco-trafficking groups. I should perhaps also specify that I'm in my research really looking at the modern period. So all the conflicts that I'm looking at are from 1980s onwards. So obviously there would be a lot of conflicts also happening before that with indigenous people, but I'm really interested in this like modern latest wave of indigenous mobilization. Then we have the condition of regime type. So here I distinguish between whether a given country is an authoritarian regime, a democracy, or a transitioning regime. I think this is like probably the most self-explanatory category, but of course in the Latin American context, it can get much more complicated because in the sense that obviously even here in Europe, we tend to, struggle with like no democracy is 100% pure and, fulfilling certain utopia of what a democracy should be. There will always be certain difficulties and it's like the way we think about democracy can often be challenged, right? We can say that, okay, we are looking at the free and fair elections, but what does it really mean to have free and fair elections? Usually say that the elections should be, or the use of coercion in those elections should be comparatively uncommon, and we are also interested in the frequency and the relative fairness of those. But then the question is, although the election process might be transparent and competitive, right, and free of any blatant fraud, we also have to take into account, right, that these processes really include a lot of other events that definitely influence. And for instance, in the case of Colombia, just a few months ago, we had the case of a presidential candidate, Miguel Uribe, being shot and later dying in the hospital. So if you have this kind of violence influencing the political and electoral processes, then of course we can debate to what extent the country should still be considered a democracy. But also when I make this kind of distinction, I'm not purely relying on my own view of things and my own impression, but there are nowadays all these indices, right, Polity and VDEM, and we can look at the scores that these countries have in these indices. And indeed, there's a massive difference between the authoritarian regimes, and particularly in the Latin America, very common military dictatorships, right, and the post dictatorial governments once the countries return to democracy, as would be the case in Chile, right, where we can see, for instance, if we look at VDEM, really a jump in the score practically overnight from some 0.1 to 0.8, and then it even grows very rapidly after. So, and then at the same time, there are countries like Mexico, right, where the transition to democracy was much more gradual, and where it was really the reformist way to democratize the regime, and one reform at a time. So there are all these, kind of nuances that we have to take into account. So even though I say that the regime type is sort of, probably the most obvious of these three categories that I generally work with, it's still kind of nuanced, and we have to be careful in defining exactly whether a country is a democracy or not. And I completely acknowledge that. And then the last condition is the group leverage, where I also distinguish 4 dimensions. So these are practically the sources of leverage. We could think of them as. So the first one of them would be really the demographic features of the group. So not only the relative size of the group within the population in the country, but also territorial dispersion, how fragmented the group is. This is a massive issue, as I already mentioned at the beginning, with many movements really, many countries really having multiple movements. But also in terms of, some features that are already given in terms of the landscape of the indigenous groups in a given country, such as if we look at the example of Colombia, right, the indigenous population there is around 4%, 4.4%. But then the diversity within those 4.4% is stunning. It's 115 indigenous groups, and then they speak among themselves 65 different languages. So indeed, these are all certain barriers to mobilization, right? If you need to communicate, if you need to organize, and so on. And then, so that would be the first source of leverage. Then the second source of leverage would be the broad alliances. So to what extent is the movement really able to appeal to wider public, to other movements as well, but also the general opinion, right? If you have, what we have learned from these movements is if you have the support of general public in your country and also abroad, the support of international institutions and so on, this all can be immensely helpful in terms of, how you can kind of work with the government if you are given the channels. I perhaps should add this also to the regime type that we spoke about, that at the end of the day, why I'm looking at regime type, it's really as a certain proxy for the existence of certain institutional channels through which the movements can really push their agenda. Obviously, these these channels won't be perfect. This is something that we really see in democracies everywhere, that it takes time to push certain demands, right? These processes are usually extremely bureaucratic. People need help, need lawyers, right? It's far from easy, but there is also some research that has already been done suggesting that movements really indeed do often have access to the institutions, but the problem is really about their ability to kind of push the demands for those institutions, which is not to put blame on them, obviously. That's, again, where the leverage comes into play. So in the sense that, there are ways that, access to the institutions can be made to matter, because obviously if you have low leverage and you have access to the institutions, you will have an issue in terms of pushing your demands through those institutions. But now I'm not talking about my own research, but other people have shown that, for instance, persistence and insistence within these institutional channels really makes, a movement succeed. So what you often need is really the worst thing that you can do is to submit a demand and then let it lay there, like not, you have to come back and ask and push and so on. Also, for instance, alliances with local politicians can help and so on. So the problem really is, or what I'm interested in when I look at democracy is really whether, the institutional channels are there, and also the levels of repression, right? Arguably, of course, democracies do repress as well, but the level of repression in an authoritarian regime, particularly if we are talking the military regimes, and then in a democratic regime, tend to be quite different. Coming back to leverage then, of course, we have seen that precisely this. I was talking about the second source of leverage, the broad alliances. So what we have seen there is that these alliances, these other movements, public opinion and so on, if they are on the side of the indigenous movement, it really helps push through the demands. Then the organizational capacity, so the extent to what the movement is organized and also able to speak with a unified voice. This tends to be very difficult. One already what I spoke about, right? All the kind of demographic differences between the groups, but also in terms of the organizational aspects of it. So there will be different actors kind of claiming to represent these groups, and to what extent can they actually work together, push demands, organize events such as protests, sit-ins, and so on. And then the last dimension of leverage in my research is the inclusion, so the extent to which the indigenous people are really part of the state institutions and given voice within the state institutions. What is also important here is the existence of indigenous parties, for instance, because many countries really have the problem that indigenous people, although they can run for Congress and other elected offices, they have to do so within the non-ethnic parties, which might make it more difficult to really voice their demands. And at the same time, if we look at, the presence once they are already in the Congress, right? It's also important to kind of account for the fact whether they are given, for instance, reserved seats, right? Whether they are in some sort of way guaranteed participation in these processes, and it can be a little bit contra-intuitive in the sense that, of course, many of these movements are really asking rather to be left alone by the state, right? To have their autonomy, have their self-governance within their territories. But at the same time, as long as you don't live again in a sort of utopia where really the state has perfectly accommodated every single demand of yours, these remain sort of negotiated processes, and you need certain presence on the state level to really be able to ensure that the state won't encroach on your rights and won't really limit the rights that you have already attained. So, yeah, these would be like, I maybe went into too much detail for a sort of first introduction of these conditions, but...
No, that's fantastic. I think that gives us a lot of great groundwork to also understand why you're gathering the information you're gathering. So just to summarize, correct me if I'm misinterpreting any of it, but the first thing I see is the general context which they can't control, which is the regime type, and then the second is kind of the context, but something that they try to create themselves, which is the socialization, how they put themselves in sort of the broader struggle, and then with leverage you also have something out of their control, which is the actual proportion of the population that they actually represent in the grander population, which is just general context for them in leverage. And then the other points of leverage, again, are things that they themselves engage in and actively produce. So you have this point where some of the factors are out of their control, and then some of the factors change over the course of the resistance movement.
Indeed, that's the idea, to kind of try to account both for the factors that are kind of more falling into the structure, right? The background, the kind of institutional setup in which they have to work, and then their agency as well as actors in politics, right, and how they organize. And I would perhaps also add to that, as we were already talking about the necessity and sufficiency, that the violent socialization really comes up in the research as a necessary component of violent mobilization. But perhaps somewhat surprisingly, changing this violent socialization is not what's immediately necessary in order to transition from violence to non-violent struggle. So often movements still maintain this kind of more revolutionary rhetoric and readiness to use arms. But due to the structural conditions kind of and structural conditions in the sense of the regime time, but also due to their leverage and their ability to exercise pressure, we could say, these might kind of motivate them to transition. So, for instance, if we are looking at the context of the democratic regimes, what my research has kind of been suggesting is that if the movements in democratic regimes, even despite being violently socialized, in democratic regimes, if they have high leverage, they will be pursuing non-violent forms of mobilization. But what becomes really dangerous are the contexts where groups have undergone violent socialization. We see the groups kind of positioning themselves precisely in this, again, the family of violent struggles, right? It is...
Can you explain violent socialization?
In the kind of concept that the movements take inspiration and learn from other movements elsewhere, as I was already explaining, this can be either geographical space or other moments in time. And then they use this experience, this kind of information, right, to mount their own struggles. So just perhaps coming a step back to what I was just saying, right, in the context where the movement has undergone this violent socialization, indeed having, and now I'm again talking about the democratic setup, having a high leverage is something that has been kind of coming out of the research as a way of preventing the kind of materialization of the armed struggle.
Would you say that it's because there's, if people see that there's a longer road to take to actually receive self-governance, achieve self-governance, that people feel like a more extreme set of means is necessary? This is kind of the case, or?
By longer road, you mean like they're lacking the means to kind of push it, or?
Yeah, if they feel as though they're more oppressed, less represented, then they feel as though maybe violence is the more extreme options are necessary, that it's like a last resort, or?
In a way, yes. Like it's I feel like everybody understands in these processes, to more or less, that it won't happen overnight, right? Usually there are several reforms that need to be put in place, and then there's also a massive gap between what has actually been accepted and put on the paper, right, and then the implementation of these things. In Colombia, the 1991 constitution really is put a solid groundwork for the relationship between the state and the indigenous people, but the problems really come with the implementation of those provisions. So I believe that everybody sort of knows that the satisfaction of all the demands won't happen overnight, but it's really more about believing that we do have what it takes to make the institutions act in our interest, right? Whereas if you are really finding yourself in a position where you don't really have much alliances, you don't really see that you are supported by others, you are kind of predisposed to not having much of an influence by the simple fact that you are really, strictly speaking, a minority, right? Like indigenous people tend to be the minorities in most states, but then also it's important to mention that there are actually states where indigenous people form the majority, and even then they might be oppressed by the institutions of the state. You see that there are really no institutions or no organizations that are fighting on your behalf, or they might be there, but more like consumed by the internal leadership disputes, right? And in addition to that, you don't really have any representation in the Congress or the more local institutions, right, the councils and so on. Then you really feel like there's no way, even though there might be existing channels, right? And the democracy is there, and like you have elections, and the elections are competitive and so on. But if you feel like, regardless of all of this, like you are left in a position where you have no means of influencing what is actually happening out there in the politics, then this is something that might radicalize you, and in combination precisely with this, what I have labeled the violent socialization, right? And this is not something that only works on the group level, right? It's something that we also know from a lot of research, and maybe in cognitive science you will have some insights on it as well, in the sense that individuals really, the kind of like bad neighborhood effect in a way, right? That if you are kind of put into a certain position where everybody around you like starts to behave in a certain way, it might radicalize you as well. So this is precisely what we have seen a lot in the cases. Particularly, I'm again thinking of the case of Colombia, where really the indigenous people found themselves surrounded by these armed groups who were attacking them, and their movement, or their armed movement, particularly the group that I'm researching in the Colombian case, is the Movimiento Armado Quintinlame, which started as a self-defense group, right? And only later they started taking like more offensive actions and really taking like more military aspects and kind of acting in a more assertive way. But at the beginning, it was all about self-defense. And going back again to the individual level, from the testimonies that we have about the case of Manuel Quintinlame, of the Movimiento Armado, there really played a massive role, for instance, the insertion of some of the leaders into jail, some of the indigenous leaders, where they were sitting side by side with the guerrilla leaders, right? So it also works on the individual level, really, if you look at particular people and how they were put into those positions, but also more on the group level, in the sense that, like, the group kind of finds itself surrounded by a certain context, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Because we have a concept called socially adapted beliefs. We see beliefs as being socially adaptive. So the environment that you're in will shape the way that you see the world. I mean, I think that plays a big role. And I think there are also situations where you can get state violence as an instigatory force to actually get individuals to respond violently, and then there's greater justification. So I think there's sort of an insidious way to use violence to generate more violence, which creates a bigger cycle.
Absolutely, and this is often the case. And again, going back to the case of Colombia, where the indigenous movement, or particularly I'm now talking about the indigenous movement of the Cauca, where the Movimiento Armado Quintilame appeared. There, it was not a single actor. It was really a combination of actors that were targeting the indigenous people, and one of them was precisely the state as well. So it's not only about sort of facing neglect, even in the context of democracy, where they were not capable of sort of participating in a level that would be sufficient for them to really satisfy the demands, but also being targeted by state actors, by the guerrillas, right, which is also another issue in the Colombian context, where the guerrillas have been so diverse, and the entire process has been so complicated in the sense that, while the indigenous movement was targeted by some guerrillas, it actually cooperated with others to even get to the position of starting an armed struggle, right? The M19 was a guerrilla that really helped in the beginnings of the formation of the indigenous armed movement. And, then you also had the massive issues that the indigenous people there had with the so-called pájaros, which were groups that were hired by the big estate owners in the region, and those were like individuals that they were hired in order to kill people who were trying to, fight on behalf of the indigenous demands. So, with this kind of like repression coming from all sides, right, be it state, be it the paramilitaries, be it the big estate owners and so on. Paramilitaries not at that time yet, but the guerrilla groups. It all creates really an environment that, kind of not only makes you feel like you have to use violence in self-defense, but also to some extent justifies, the use of violence for your own purposes, because you might be socialized into thinking that, okay, if everybody around me is using violence as a sort of legitimate political tool, then what is stopping me from doing that, right? And indeed, it's kind of really multifaceted and...
maybe not justifying violence, but making it seem legitimate.
Yes.
So,
yes.
At least legitimizing it socially. Yeah, that's quite a difficult... I mean, even while you're describing it, it's suffocating, to imagine that much state oppression coming from so many different sides, literally just for erasure and eradication of indigenous groups as a political issue, for the governance.
Indeed, and not to mention that by many, or in many, or practically all of these cases, the matter of indigenous recognition is not only with regard to really some abstract rights and, culture and education, things like that, but it gets very material form in terms of the struggle for land. And there it really clashes harshly with many actors, and particularly given the fact that a lot of these governments have really implemented neoliberal economic policies that very often go against the interests of indigenous people. The struggle has become very much... material in the sense that truly the threat that both the indigenous people have against themselves is existential, but also, all these property owners might feel like it's existential for them because they want my land that they feel like they are entitled to own, right? So it's this entire, also another layer of the conflict, right? That we should not think of the indigenous struggles as only a conflict over these like abstract rights and their cultures and so on, but it's really a very material conflict in terms of access to land and also other issues when it comes to these mega projects, right? Building dams and destroying the environment and so on. So it's again, like, it's suffocating just to think of all the dimensions that the indigenous struggle actually has.
Yeah, and when you bring up sort of neoliberal policies also, that the struggle, especially in Latin America, is heavily influenced by American imperial policies. And you had mentioned while we were speaking, especially of the impact that NAFTA had on South America, which we know was crushing for so many groups. And there were even sort of protests that emerged and erupted, formed out of inspired by the Zapatistas in Washington, Seattle, Washington, the late 90s. I think it was 1999. So there's this kind of feedback group in terms of the socialization side of how people are trading information and using that to revolt, but just how the policies, like you bring up, are not just limited to the state that somebody's resisting in, but also larger states that have sort of imperial interests over them.
Oh, absolutely. And also the case of the Zapatistas is really interesting in the sense that they have become themselves a group that is then used in the process of socialization of so many other groups, right? Because their experience has been really valuable in terms of knowing how to mobilize and the tools that are kind of at one's disposal. It's just important also to really qualify the fact that the NAFTA treaty was used in the case of Zapatista as more of a sort of symbolic step or gesture, right? The fact that their rebellion was mounted on the 1st of January 1994 when the NAFTA was coming into force. It was mostly symbolic, but really the entire reason for the movement to appear are much more profound, and the mobilization of the Zapatistas already started forming and brewing in the 1980s, and then sometimes it's said that the 92 reform of Article 27 that was regarding the agriculture, access to land, right, and agricultural reform, and giving a lot of people, indigenous people, but also peasants more in general, giving them hope of accessing their own land. And then suddenly this was revoked. And it was, again, part of the neoliberal policies, right? Because part of the reform as it was undergoing was really giving access to indigenous people to land. And this access was often taking the form of communal lands, right? And what what the neoliberal reforms really needed was kind of to individualize the parcels that people were holding, right, and to then allow for their sales, because the communal lands as such couldn't be sold; they could only be inherited. So all these issues kind of came into place. So suddenly they found themselves and again, this comes to the more material side of the struggle, right? That suddenly people found themselves in a position where not only no further claims would be satisfied to land, but also the ones who already recovered their land were risking having the land taken away from them. And then in addition to this, of course, all the discrimination, the lack of access to basic livelihoods, right? It created a sort of really, we could say, a powder keg, right, in the region of Chiapas that then blew up in 94. But indeed, particularly later on, this became a massive topic when the Zapatistas really positioned themselves in again, talking about the socialization, right, the wider network of conflicts that are led against neoliberalism and these kind of policies, which is, by the way, also something that has helped the Zapatistas a lot in terms of their leverage, really, these broad alliances. And I think they are really the example par excellence of what can having the broad alliances do for you and where can it get you.
Yeah, and can you walk us through, say, an application of your methodology for one of the cases at least, or both, or all three, however you feel like doing it. But it'd be nice to kind of get a sense of, now that we have a greater context of how you're actually looking at it and what the methodology is, maybe walking us through, say, the Colombian case and actually looking at socialization, regime type, and leverage. Are you looking at it over decades, or are you taking it as a snapshot in the present moment?
So I'm looking at it over time, but I'm perceiving it as sort of fluid, right? So I'm not taking necessarily snapshots in the sense let's look at what it was like in 85, at 1990, right? The way that I'm working with these terms is really that I'm interested more in these like critical junctures, like these moments when something changed in the movement and what preceded it, right? So you mentioned the Colombian case, for instance. There I have already been kind of describing the process of socialization that really went through, the circumstances in which the movement kind of found itself and being targeted from all possible sides. But it was also a moment where the movement was with low leverage in a democratic setting, right? Now, again, like I'm pretty sure that there would be people who would like argue with me in terms of like whether Colombia was truly democratic and whether it still is. But just bear with me for a second. In terms of the leverage, the indigenous movement in Colombia has actually been very effective in terms of organizing itself already since the early 1970s, when the first indigenous institution or organization, the CRIC, in the region of Cauca was born, and then also in the 80s, actually, the National Organization of Indigenous People was born, and so we could say that they were kind of hopeful signs in terms of really the organizational capacity. But of course, it also went hand in hand with, leadership disputes, not between these two organizations, but then there was another organization, the ISO, that kind of split from the CRIC. So I won't go into all the details of the indigenous politics here. But indeed, to some extent, the leverage as purely looking on organizational capacity looked promising. But the other sides of the leverage were really not so profound. So in terms of the broad alliances, the movement was not particularly efficient. There were some alliances going on with the broader campesino or the peasant movement, and also in terms of like the labor movement, but it was still sort of not that advanced. Then we also had, again, I was already sort of describing the demographic aspects of the leverage, right, with Colombian indigenous people finding themselves in a particularly difficult position in this sense, not only being a small minority in the overall population, but also in all the other indicators, like being very territorially dispersed and fragmentalized and so on. And then before the 1990 and the constitutional process that led to the 91 constitution, also the inclusion of indigenous people was particularly grim, right? So all these, issues kind of converged. So first of all, also coming back to the regime type, despite the fact that Colombia was a democracy, right, and there were competitive elections going on at that point, after the fall of the National Front, but I won't really go into too much details regarding the Colombian political regime. But the issue is that despite being democracy, there were, particularly caused by the armed conflict, segments of the territory where the state really had a difficult time arriving. And when it did arrive, it was usually in form of oppression, in the sense that it would arrive on the side of these, estate owners that I was earlier mentioning, and so on. So really, this kind of combination of factors, right, being inserted in a context where violence is going on, it's targeted against you, in addition to, state being a democracy, so in theory, like certain channels could exist, but you were really, unable to access them, one, because really practical state absence in certain areas, but also because of the low leverage that you had at that moment. So all these kind of factors converged at one moment when the Movimiento Armado Quintín emerged. This is the period we are talking about is 1985, with the first sort of action already taking place in December 84. But this is the moment that the movement really erupts on the scene, and it starts evolving. First, it kind of erupts as part of an alliance, we could perhaps say, with another guerrilla movement, which was a splinter group from the FARC. I think that probably all the listeners will have heard of the FARC at some moment. It's the armed group that now in 2016 signed the peace agreement in Colombia, which by no means the end of the Colombian armed conflict. But again, coming back now to the Movimiento Armado Quintín-Lame, which emerged on the scene in '85 with this Frente Ricardo Franco, was the movement that kind of sided with them. But then it also evolved into a struggle wherein they fought alongside other guerrilla groups, particularly the M19 was really a massive ally for them at one point. And then they transitioned. So gradually their leverage started to change, right? So first of all, they started forming more alliances with the armed groups in the sense of the Coordinadora Simón Bolívar, Coordinadora Guerrillera Simón Bolívar, appearing to sort of coordinate between the different guerrillas, which again, the landscape of the guerrillas was really diverse and chaotic, we could say. And then with the approaching constitutional process in 1991, this was really a moment that started to change a lot in terms of the indigenous people's ability to imagine certain inclusion within the Colombian state. So we could see all these factors sort of converging at certain moment where not only was it also, it's another important factor that it was really a moment where the government was in processes with many different guerrillas, and there was this general spirit in the society that was very in favor of peace, right? And people were very keen. Like, we are talking of a context where, Colombia has been ravaged by armed conflict. We could say from the 1960s, there's usually this latest conflict, but also, before experiencing decades and decades of violence. So it's people get fed up at some point and really want peace. So this end of the 1980s, beginning of 1990s was a particularly, important moment in terms of this mood in the society that was happening. And then for the indigenous movement in particular, this got really reflected in when it came to the elections to the Constitutional Assembly, where 2 indigenous representatives were elected. And in addition, as part of the disarmament process of Movimiento Armado Quintín-Lame, they were also offered that their representative would make it to the assembly. It might not sound like a lot to have 3 indigenous people in total representing you, but the way to really look at it is through the achievements that they managed to get, right? Even though the representative of the Movimiento Armado was not given the right to vote, he was only put there with the right to speak, right? But in cooperation with the other 2, who also, it's important to note that came from organizations. One of them was from the ONIC and the other one from ISO at that point already, ICO, who, had their differences. Like, it's not like, everything was harmonical and so on, and everybody, just came and was automatically predisposed to work together. Like, they really managed to make it work together. And so it was also this moment of the organizational capacity within the movement really rising, right, in the sense of the movement really being able to work as one, right, to work in a sort of united sense. And not to mention that, for instance, the ISO was historically always very opposed to the Movimiento Armado Quintín-Lame, but then within the context of the assembly, they really managed to set their differences aside and work as one. And then also the wider sentiment in the society really gets reflected in the fact that, despite being just a few, they managed to push through the assembly so many provisions that in reality helped indigenous people in access to land, in self-determination aspects, right? Very self-determination as self-governance, right? Giving them the rights to govern themselves based on their own customary laws, in terms of cultural rights and so on. So there you also see, the broader alliance with the other representatives at the assembly that was really needed for them to push this through. The process eventually also spilled over, and now we can say that the indigenous movement in Colombia is truly if not the, then definitely one of the most powerful social actors in Colombia, social movements. They have really managed to, build a very powerful movement that is respected, that is renowned, that the politicians dialogue with. They have been able to also create amazing networks among between not only like the indigenous organizations among themselves, but also in terms of cooperation with other societal sectors. And although there has been some fragmentation, let's not make this way too optimistic. There has been, particularly among like the political subjects that run in the elections, which is not always good in the sense of the ability of the movement to speak with a sort of unified voice. But indeed, the tendency has been very optimistic in a sense.
Yeah, amazing. And so it's the point at which they put down arms was the point at which they got representation?
Indeed. So
right.
Those two, so the assembly that changed the constitution was already ongoing as the process of disarmament with Quintin Lame was kind of finalized, and then they laid their weapons soon before the, I think it was like a month before the end of the assembly, and the representative of theirs still managed to take part in the assembly. But so these were, you could really see it in the sense of like one process influencing the other as the negotiations kind of progressed, and the representation that was really going to be meaningful kind of crystallizing in the Constitutional Assembly.
Yeah, so do you find generally that, because taking up arms is such a big decision, and what it does is endanger and ensure that your population will suffer not only years, potentially decades of violence, and in situations of conflict, women suffer immensely because there's a lot of misogyny involved in the use of violence as a negotiating tactic, and so I'm sure you would agree, but the decision for violence is not taken lightly, and then it's almost like the use of violence is a strategic use in order to gain the ability to negotiate, because then the use of violence becomes part of their leverage, I suppose, right? It's if we will continue to engage in violence unless we have the ability to speak, and it's not that the demands are met through the violence, it's that the violence is a leverage tool to get to speak and negotiate, and then the negotiations are done after violence is abandoned. Does that track with you?
It can be the case, okay. But often these movements, and maybe that doesn't even go against what you were saying, but in the sense that they are pretty sure that they won't be able to obtain the concessions that they need by the use of violence, but the violence might be used as a sort of, a bridge to getting to what we need in order to get the concessions, right? So what I'm thinking here is precisely, again, the case of the Zapatistas in Mexico, which, like, we know from all the testimonies that they knew from the very beginning that they were not going to defeat the Mexican military, right? Like, they knew that the violence per se would not get them the concessions they needed, but they knew that, and those were things that they really had to plan carefully and required a lot of courage, because when they struck in the military offensives of the 1st of January, they really took important cities, and they knew that their actions had to be shocking enough to attract attention, right? So it's about this use of violence as a tool, not necessarily to extract the concessions immediately, but just to put yourself in a position from which you will be able to do so. So precisely, they knew that from the very beginning, if the action is loud enough, they obviously could not envisage that it would go that far. And they themselves, from the testimonies, it comes out that they were really shocked by the actual amount of attention that their struggle received. But indeed, it has been there since the very beginning, this kind of idea that we are going to shock at the very least the Mexican public from the indifference that we see them employing in their daily life and towards the policies of the state. And Uh, so yeah, I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I think that's great.
In some instances, it can also it depends a lot because the violence can become very counterproductive. If we look at the case of Chile and the Coordinadora Arauco Maeco and then all the other splinter groups that came after, it's a context where the state insists on the fact that it won't negotiate with anybody who's violent. So obviously the Mapuche movement in Chile is very wide, and there are a lot of actors who claim to represent the Mapuche demands. Among them, one being the Coordinadora already since the late 1990s. And the state has always been adamant in the sense that violence won't be a way to get the concessions you want, particularly if we are talking about land, right? They have always made a kind of point out of not negotiating about land purchases with groups that are violent. But we know that in practice it has not always been followed. That this is the rhetoric that the government kind of has, but then other sources tend to be quite observant in the sense that it's not quite true, and that negotiations have taken place with groups that were armed. So it's there's really, what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is that there's no easy answer to that question, and it can unfold in many different ways across different movements.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm against the use of violence as a tool in any situation, but I also don't believe in the vilification of individuals, marginalized groups who engage in violence, because I can understand how that's in extreme circumstances legitimized internally, even though I don't disagree. I don't believe in passing judgment. But you also, part of the counterproductive aspect of it is that you can very easily shift the narrative of resistance in away from your favor. So by engaging in violence, the broader public can see you as the villain, and the sort of the establishments, the institutions' narrative against you can be strengthened and justified. And you had told me while we were speaking earlier the case of, I think it was in Chiapas, where they had taken a local town and they had taken a strong stance towards helping the villagers and making sure that everybody in the village knew that their conflict was not with them. And it seems like a great narrative victory, even though they took the town. If you could go through that example.
Yeah, sure. And actually, I also have another example of that. Hopefully, I will still remember to get back to it at the end of this. So in precisely in the case of Chiapas, I did a lot of interviews in the town of San Cristobal de las Casas, and to see how the local population experienced the Zapatista uprising in 94. And this is something that the Zapatistas did very well. And again, just to perhaps support your point about violent groups often facing a difficult time in achieving their demands, precisely because they alienate the public, right? So we have a lot of research that is kind of showing the moment that the movement decides to use violence, it really turns against them. But the Zapatistas managed to do something different. So one was really the kind of surprising and the scale of the action that they managed to take in taking not only this town, also other towns in Chiapas, but let's now focus on the case of San Cristobal. And then, so the kind of grand action in terms of we are not just another guerrilla there in the countryside, just attacking a military convoy and running away, but this bold action, we actually took the town, accompanied by the fact that, again, it was the eve of the NAFTA coming into force. It really added a big symbolic strength, and it was easy for the media to notice, also international media. We are not even talking just within the country, but also the general public, and people became curious, right? It kind of generated curiosity, who is this group that we never heard of, and suddenly appeared. And what they managed to do really well, when we are talking about this context in which they prevented the public from turning against themselves, was really that from the very beginning they were framing the struggle as nothing selfish, as like we are struggling for all of you, and particularly being very so when we look at the first declaration, they call these declarations of the Lacandon jungle, and the first one of them explicitly describes their struggle as one for food, for work, for housing, like it goes into like all these like demands that they have, and they are not ethnical. And they later like kind of clarify this, that, although we are an indigenous movement and we are like overwhelmingly composed of indigenous people, the leaders were saying it from the beginning, that the idea behind not framing the struggle as indigenous in this first kind of document that they issued was really to make people believe that this is a struggle of everybody, right? That we are here to kind of represent you all who feel like you are not part of Mexico of today. This is something that the Zapatistas really maintained in their rhetoric ever since. They tend to really frame themselves as a voice speaking on behalf of our marginalized people. May they be LGBTQ communities, may there be people who are otherwise targeted by neoliberal policies. Also not necessarily minorities, also women, right, which are not really a minority, but have found themselves like historically oppressed in a certain setting. So the idea is more to frame the struggle as very broad, as representing a lot of wide interests, and also the fact that in this first declaration they were very explicit about the fact that they were not going to target civilians. That's something that, particularly in the eyes of the people that I have spoken to, who were in San Cristobal and who were the civilians that could have gotten potentially targeted, this made a big difference in terms of how they viewed the movement, right? The fact that they didn't have to be scared, or they felt like they didn't have to be. Like, they usually described it in the way that, the only thing that we feared was getting caught in the crossfire, when the military would come and fighting would start. But in terms of kind of fearing the group itself, that didn't happen. Of course, at the very first moments it did, like when the movement or the Zapatista army took San Cristobal, many people felt a lot of fear. I have often heard these kind of accounts of an idea that lived in the local imaginary of they're called the Coletos, like the mestizo inhabitants of San Cristobal, who believed that the so-called Chamula, people from this village that is on the outskirts of San Cristobal, which is San Juan Chamula, will come to San Cristobal and kill them all in this kind of, reclamation or like retaking of the indigenous lands, right? They believe that, like, okay, we knew that the Spaniards took this land from the Chamulas, and they thought that, like, okay, there was this legend, somewhere in the back of their heads that, like, the Chamulas will come one day and take this land. So people, like, when this happened, and when the Zapatista army came in, like, some people were like, okay, this is the moment that my grandma told me about, no? So there was certain fear for a moment, but then the Zapatistas also captured the radio. They read their declaration at the main square, and they gradually managed to create among people really the feeling that, like, oh, okay, they are not here to hurt us. I heard, for instance, like one personal story from one of the interviewees who mentioned the case of her grandma, who was staying with them at that time. And on the 1st of January, she was walking past a market, and there was a sort of shop that the Zapatistas just looted, and there was a broken shampoo laying on the ground. And the man with a gun came to the woman, to the grandma of this interviewee, and told her, "Pick it up. It's yours. Like, nothing will happen to you. This belongs to all of us." So and the grandma took the shampoo and then went home. And then also in the memory of this interview, her dad actually told the grandma off, and he was really scared that, oh no, now you are one of them, and like, what will happen? But that for the interviewee herself, she mentioned this as the moment that she realized, oh, it's fine. Like, they are not here to hurt us. They are, they're on our side in a way. They're, again, fighting for all of us. So I believe that, these were certain commitments and certain ways of approaching the struggle that really helped Zapatistas from the onset, and like continued to help them even in the years after. And then there was the second case that I just remembered that I also thought I could mention when you were talking about the fact, how, because this is a good illustration of, how the public can turn back against you, and, the active strategies that the movement took in order for that not to happen. But then you also mentioned the case of the state weaponizing the mobilization against you. And a good example of this is really what happened in Chile with precisely the Coordinadora Arauco Mayaco that led to, the wider Mapuche movement really being criminalized there was already some criminalization going on before, like not to discard it, but the kind of intensification in terms of the prosecution of the Mapuche and using this internal state security law and anti-terrorism law to really alienate the public from the Mapuche cause, painting them as terrorists, even though for a really long time, the Mapuche were also very adamant in the sense that they were not going to target people. They didn't want, even though they resorted to violent struggle, they did not want victims to really lose their lives in their attacks. So, they would come to a house of an administrator of a certain plot of land, and they would want to put the house on fire, but they would first wake them up, take them out, and then set the house on fire. Of course, this, with the progression of the years, it got to a point where eventually people would die in those incidents. But at the beginning, this was the idea, right? But even regardless of that, the Chilean state really made a point out of painting them as dangerous terrorists, which the public really bought into. And it was practically until the estallido social, these big protests that Chile experienced between 2019, 2020, when the larger public in Chile would really start realizing that, the Mapuche weren't terrorists all along, right? They had legitimate causes and legitimate things to struggle for. And, many of the interviews that I did in Chile were actually alluding to this fact about how, they as Mapuche felt empowered in the moment of the estallido when they saw the Mapuche flags, in the crowds, and reportedly in some protests there were more Mapuche flags than Chilean flags. And suddenly the narrative completely changing in the Chilean society regarding, who the Mapuche were. And, once the white public got targeted brutally by the police in the protests, people started to realize, okay, maybe the Mapuche had a point, and maybe our state is the one that's behaving inappropriately, right? So those are just, some examples.
Yeah, it's so important, because I think what we have is here the constant struggle that we've, I guess, always had in terms of resistance and oppression, is there are two opposite forces which can be used as tools. Fear, which is typically used by the oppressor, the colonialist, and empathy, which ought to be generated by a resistance group if they want to be successful, because usually they're marginalized because they're a minority. Not always, but that's usually the case. So you have this appeal towards empathy, and I think that what the Zapatistas do, right, is a struggle that can be felt by most people, no matter what group they make up in any nation they're in, is that they're working class. And so the struggles of the working class is kind of this underlying point through which we can all feel empathy with one another. And I think that is so aptly wielded by the Zapatistas in Mexico, where it even reverberates through movements in the United States.
Indeed, and this is really one of the lessons that we can draw from these mobilizations, right? About precisely the importance of how you frame your struggle and the alliances that you make, and at the end of the day, it's precisely like these masses that share something with you, right? Like my research is about the indigenous people who tend to have very particular demands and very particular, kind of, yeah, we could say demands or what they want to achieve. But I'm not necessarily also in the conclusions that I make in my research saying that this must apply only to indigenous people, right? Because at the end of the day, like many of the demands, such as not be discriminated, have access to resources that just really enable me to survive, and just getting basic dignity and recognition from the state, are really demands that are there in the society in general, like are demands that every human being in a way has. So that's why, I'm, although because I have not tested any of what I'm saying, like on any other than indigenous movements, I'm not like extrapolating to other ones, but at the same time, I'm not saying that, okay, what I'm saying does not necessarily have to be only about indigenous movements, right? It can practically apply to any movements that have political demands, I would say, because obviously that's another question of when we, for instance, look again at the case of Colombia, where the conflict that Colombia is experiencing nowadays really has its roots in very ideological struggles, and the fact that during this National Front, left-wing parties or political subjects like were not able to kind of enter the or like, let's say, more radical than left-wing than liberal left-wing. Could not enter into the political picture, so they felt like, again, like resorting to arms was maybe their only chance. But this struggle has transformed over the years and has led to a situation where not only the guerrillas that started with some political ideals, but also the groups that then were created, the paramilitaries, in response to the guerrillas, right? And then the profound conflict that came out of that. Nowadays, when you look at these armed groups, many of them have, or practically all of them have, also economic component to their struggle, and really with this like narco trafficking networks and interests that are, I would even say, more powerful than the political struggle, in the sense, because when you have political demands, you can negotiate on it. And like the state can make concessions that are going to, give you a voice, that will incorporate you into the government and so on. But if you have more like, if you benefit out of the chaos itself materially, like, so, if you really are fighting for the control of territories where you can grow coca and then benefit immensely out of selling that coca, right? Like, you do get a lot of incentive that the state can't meet. Like, what could the state possibly give you that would replace these millions of peso dollars that you can get from the drug trafficking, right? So so that's like one caveat that I would definitely put to anything that I'm saying, that even though it does not necessarily have to be only about indigenous groups, it would definitely apply only to groups that have certain political grievances and political ideals behind their mobilization.
Yeah, it seems to me that there are two categories of groups that are using violence. And the group that has demands is an optimistic group, in that they're using the violence strategically. And then you have somewhere in this gap is something like pessimism, but on the other end you have the cynical group. And the cynical group is using violence opportunistically because they don't believe that anything can change. And so the opportunism has taken hold, and there are no demands. The demands is, let us keep operating because that's the only way that we care to exist. And I think that it's really telling and also crushingly sad to see a group go from an optimistic demand-wielding group to individuals who forego the demands, lapse into cynicism, and then just engage in violence and opportunism.
Indeed, and it's unfortunately a process that many of these groups, now I'm not talking indigenous groups, but like groups that rise in arms, eventually face, because once you really open up the door to a certain, strategy, it's difficult to really ensure that you will continue being the one who will define the borders of that strategy, right? Like it's very difficult to make sure that others won't come after you, that will really use this vehicle that you have already created and manipulate it for their own purposes. And this is also, to a very large extent, the problem that Colombia is having nowadays with its armed conflict, and why it's so difficult to negotiate with, be it the spoilers of the peace with the FARC, that have like the groups that either never accepted the peace agreement or kind of remobilized afterwards. When it kind of turned out that the agreement is not really being implemented the way that it should, or also, movements that are complete or well left out of the 2016 peace process, who continue to operate, and, kind of new groups that are emerging, right? And then the government, Petro, when he won the election, he won with this promise of paz total, no? Like this complete peace that he would bring to the country. But it's, with every single year, it's turning out to be more and more impossible to achieve it. And, I believe that to a large extent, this is precisely one of the reasons, right? The fact that the subjects that are perpetrating the violence nowadays really are lacking political motifs on which you could negotiate.
Yeah, because Petro himself was part of the group that was the optimistic group, sort of engaging in violence because they had demands.
Exactly.
Yeah, but you have, anytime you engage in violence, then it's a race to the bottom, because then any group that wins out, the person who might take control is the person who's the most violent. And this is the thing that...
Yeah, and this is actually a great way to also, make us think about it, because precisely the guerrilla group that Petro came out of is the M19 that started as a response to the 1970 election, wherein, like, I won't go into too much detail, but there was this other subject, the ANAPO, that wanted to run in the election and wanted to run for a president as well. But because there was this national pact between the liberals and the conservative, and it was, they were taking turns in like who's going to have the president. So many believed that it was supposed to be the ANAPO leader who would become the next president, and that the entire election was a fraud, right? So the M19 started from a kind of legitimate political grievance, in a sense. Like, of course, we can now discuss whether, like how to know if the election was really a fraud, because, we get politicians shouting left and right that every single election is a fraud. But, you could argue that like they had a certain grievance, right, with which they kind of mobilized. And then when we look at their process of demobilization, which happened at the same time as the one of the Movimiento Armado Quintin-Lame, was precisely also motivated to a large extent by the fact that, by the perspective of the Constitutional Assembly, right? And them knowing that they will be able to take part. And indeed, when they disarmed before the Assembly and transformed into a political party, they did manage to, like, the election to the Constitutional Assembly was a big success for the M19. So, indeed, this is a perfect kind of illustration of him coming from a guerrilla that had demands that were negotiable, right? Demands that they were able to transform into like concrete political steps that they were able to, and also given the institutional chance to really fight for, right? Like within which they could fight for them, for the demands. I mean, if I make any sense. So that's perhaps just to say precisely that Petro like belonged to this like old generation of guerrillas, we could say, where the demands were kind of easier. I don't want to say easier because obviously they were still difficult to negotiate, but it was at least possible.
Yeah, and you have the situation where that's just the first step in the process. Like you have Petro elected more recently, you have Obrador having been elected several years before, but the progress that's generated, that's almost the first step. And then you might take a couple of steps backward before you're able to take a few steps forward. And it might seem like movements aren't necessarily as successful when they start out, but you kind of have to take a long view, unfortunately.
Definitely, yes. It's not something that will happen overnight. And for instance, Mexico had this new indigenous reform just last year, 2024. And many people obviously, and this is like another reform in a string of reforms, right? There was the 2001 indigenous reform that came, like we could say that to some extent came from the San Andres Accords that were signed with the Zapatistas. Obviously, they were like really kind of cut and melted down, so the core of what actually made it to the 2001 reform was like really insufficient in comparison to everything that was negotiated. But, it was a certain step forward. And then, so it might really take decades, the process. And obviously in the 2024 reform, there are still, aspects of it that are being criticized. And it was preceded by these consultations with the communities. And out of the consultations, so many more suggestions came up. But only a fraction of them really made it into the 2024 reform. And, this is not to diminish its importance. Like, it's still a massive step forward. But indeed, it's a process, right? Like, we won't achieve it all overnight. And it's something that must be, kept in mind. And at the same time, we must only hope that the governments that come will perhaps, continue with this tendency, and as you said, won't be a step back, because this can be a massive, setback not only for the indigenous people but also more in general. We saw so Petro is, for instance, in Colombia, not able to proceed with his policy of total peace, but we can't only blame Petro for that, because already the previous government of Ivan Duque was doing a horrible job in implementing the 2016 peace agreement with the FARC. So at the end of the day, if, all the guerrillas see is that even the one that did strike an agreement with the government is really struggling at the end of the day, and the government is not fulfilling its side of the deal, then this is going to have an effect. So even one bad government that is like against, everything that the previous governments did can really mess things up.
Yeah, and how do you, through your work, do you see a way to maintain leverage over successive generations without a return to the use of force? Because I think that's one of the greatest fears, right? Is after you give up the violent struggle, there are going to be, if it takes decades, there are going to be generations of people who grew up never having experienced the violent struggle. They might not understand why the demands are so important. So there has to be a way to maintain some kind of social or narrative leverage to engender the political will, in a democratic system. If it's an autocratic system, it doesn't really matter. But do you see any of your points as being crucial to try to maintain, that anybody can maintain?
I mean, I would say that definitely the maintenance of leverage is a key precondition for maintaining the channels of struggle, maintaining the struggle within the channels that exist, the institutional channels. In my research, when I mentioned, for instance, in the regime type, I was distinguishing the authoritarian regime, the transitioning regime, and the democratic regime. But for instance, one big question mark, by transitioning here, I meant democratizing, and one big question mark is what might happen if we go backwards, right? So, and again, because the cases I was working on were really, from the 1980s onwards, it's not, I can talk about this, but it would be counterfactuals, right? We haven't yet observed, we could perhaps argue that, I don't know, Brazil with Bolsonaro really managed to do a lot of harm to indigenous people. But in general, we have not observed this kind of backward tendency that would actually lead to armed indigenous mobilization. So it's difficult to really make predictions about that for me right now. But at the same time, of course, the assumption behind the theory is that the maintenance of high leverage is necessary for the movement to continue channeling their demands non-violently. Of course, again, because I was talking about this configurational causation, right? So these causes kind of acting in coordination. So I would just also add that the violent socialization again would be necessary in that case. So if you would have a movement that is not even like attempting violent socialization. It's not really in its rhetoric, like using references to these struggles, doesn't seem to be learning from those struggles. And at the same time just has low leverage, like it's likely to just, stay non-violent. But once it starts kind of, bringing violence into the realm of possibility by, learning from these violent struggles and kind of bringing them into the question, then the low leverage really becomes a problem. And I could perhaps also add a qualification here, because I don't think I specified that in my research. What is kind of coming up is that, no movement really needs to have all 4 dimensions of leverage high. Like it's usually 2 dimensions of leverage high that seem to be already exercising this like conflict transformative effect. So perhaps the lesson to take from that is that really the leverage can sort of travel, right? It can change, it can be fluid, it can take different forms over time. It doesn't necessarily mean that the leverage has to, so for instance, in the case of Zapatistas, right? If it was the increase in organizational capacity and their broad alliances that helped them transform from violent to non-violent struggle, it doesn't mean that in the future, and this is something that we are kind of seeing, that, with certain worsening of the organizational capacity within the indigenous movement at large in Mexico, with a lot of fractionalization and disputes within the movement and so on, that you can't replace that dimension of leverage with another dimension. So, for instance, inclusion, that we have seen really growing in Mexico in recent years. Now we could, again, like dispute this entire thing because, for instance, in 2017 and 2021, like reforms were put in place that were meant to ensure better indigenous representation in the Congress and to guarantee sort of their representation there. But then many people, of course, argue that, a lot of those people who run for the indigenous or in the indigenous districts are, not truly indigenous. So then it also opens up another like large question of, how do we define an indigenous person and what are like the kind of criteria that they should meet according to the state institutions to be considered indigenous. So perhaps all of that just to say that like the leverage can, take different forms in different periods, and it can be sort of fluid. Like it's not like the sort of leverage that helped you transition from conflict to nonviolence has to stay the same going into the future. But indeed, certain supposition that you will maintain some form of high leverage is indeed within the argument as such.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you want to go into, sort of as we move towards wrapping up, some of the key takeaways, if there's anything you didn't touch upon already? I feel like you already touched upon a lot, so I can get if you're like, yeah, that's a lot of what I have to say. But if there are things that you feel you haven't touched on in terms of, what you found.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I managed to touch upon all the major aspects of my work. Of course, it's, I'm just a person who loves visualizing the things that I talk about in my own work, because I just feel that for the reader it makes much more sense to, see it sort of illustrated, particularly if we talk about all these interactions among conditions, right? It can get like very abstract and sort of difficult to imagine. Like
actually, if you send images, I can put them in the show notes.
Okay.
That way people can
nice.
sort of yeah.
So I don't want to get like into too much like nitty-gritty detail of how the entire model works, because I feel like it would just be difficult to really follow my reasoning. But in terms of what I hope that the research really brings, it's mostly some sort of like inclusion of the indigenous struggle, or better inclusion in the studies of like violence and self-determination struggles wherein violence has been used. And this does not mean that we are thinking of indigenous groups as ones that are like particularly predisposed to use violence. Quite the contrary, actually. Many of these indigenous groups really have like cosmovisions that sort of make them like live very pacific forms, like lifestyles and in relationship with like nature and environment. But kind of bringing into attention like the particular context in which these struggles might really transform into something much more radical. And usually these stories really are ones of a combination of grievances and structural factors and agency that the groups have. And perhaps if you were saying like if there's anything that I haven't touched upon, then because we have spoken a lot about how this all unfolds in democracies, and we have really not talked so much about the authoritarian side of things. So and again, this is where the conjunctural causation really comes into place, because it is important for high leverage in order to exercise the effect that I was talking about to take place in a democratic regime. If we are talking about the authoritarian setup where, practically all the channels are closed and, you feel like you cannot really engage with the government in any way that would not contain violence, then the high leverage is actually something that intensifies the conflict. So at least that's what, kind of one of the conclusions is, that while you can also get conflicts in authoritarian regimes with low leverage, like those really tend to be, precisely this hit and run kind of tactics. But if you get high leverage within an authoritarian regime setup, you get full-blown civil war kind of situation. So yeah, that's perhaps just something that I don't feel like we have addressed. So again, coming back to this configurational causality, in the sense that we have to pay attention to like the entire constellation of factors. Like we cannot reduce it only to leverage or only to socialization by itself, right? It's a fuller picture that we kind of need to keep in mind.
Yeah, and where do you see sort of this work going? It can be your work specifically or folks that you work with and this specific subset of the field. Where do you see it going over the next decade or two?
That's, as always, very good question. So, I mean, there are several trends that are like more broadly in peace and conflict studies, where like I think will definitely make it into like also this like very specific subfield of like violence in indigenous cases or something, which is really focused on individuals a lot. So going to the micro level, this is something that we have seen unfold over the past decade in peace and conflict studies, whereas in the 2000s, the idea was more like doing all these studies at the state level and not really disaggregating the data, and like a lot of quantitative research that was, running regression on the data that we had on states and which states are sort of more predisposed to experience conflict and so on. Whereas nowadays the research is really more and more focused on the individual, right, on the micro level, like the decisions that individuals make, how they decide to take part in violence, which, again, like talking of the violent socialization, and we sort of already mentioned it, that, from what we know, like on the individual level, really the socialization is one of the core things that make an individual, participate in violence, or also like other, it can also be the source of other decisions in an armed conflict. So like if you see everybody around you flee, then you might flee, right? This kind of thing. So I think one might be like this kind of trend, and second, in terms of, and that's again like more on the quantitative side, the use of experimental or quasi-experimental designs that is also quite spreading and maybe even becoming the mainstream. So I think this is also something that we might see unfold. Like, don't ask me how specifically would I employ these kind of designs in the context of indigenous groups and the use of violence or violent mobilization, but I think that these are trends that might kind of mirror the larger trends in peace and conflict studies.
Yeah, I mean, as a cognitive scientist, I like to trend towards the individual. I think that also makes a lot of sense. um, cool. And kind of finally, why why do you do the work that you do? What attracted you to the topic, and what kind of gives you fulfillment through the work?
Ah, wow. When we are working in the PhD, particularly for such a long time, like we can sometimes really lose track of like the big ideas that drove us at the beginning. So thank you for the question. But I suppose it was always a sort of fascination with violence. That would sound horrible, but more with the other side of the coin, right? Like. Particularly during my BA, I had a lot of like experiences in like I traveled to Bosnia and spoke to a lot of people there and in Northern Ireland, right? And and I found it kind of fascinating the mental setup, right, and how people thought of the conflicts of that happened in their countries and their way forward. So relatively easy in my university studies, this has become a question that interested me, and with my BA thesis, I worked on transitional justice, right, and how we can actually get from the end of conflict to something like reconciliation in a society, right, and what could be the efficient strategy or effective strategies to get to a point where not only have we ended a conflict, but we have actually managed to create a society where sometimes we talk about this, in terms of the sort of positive piece, right? That we really manage to transform the structures so that they don't, and society, like the relationships within the society, to be more egalitarian, for instance, right? So this kind of transformation to a society that is less likely to experience violence, but also the question of like forgiveness, and like under what circumstances we could say, like, are people like willing to forgive the past crimes, and what forms of justice, because there is this entire debate between the retributive and restorative justice in conflict studies, right? And like, so what forms of justice can actually bring more of a lasting peace? And we see this also very interesting case being Colombia with its transitional justice system, which is really trying to see how far the restorative path can take us. But that would be a longer conversation. But yeah, just to come back to your question, so I think it was kind of stemming from this interest and these early experiences in my university studies, and then also I suppose to a certain extent the fact that I'm a Czech, and when I speak concretely of the self-determination conflicts, we had this divorce between the Czechs and Slovaks that was very peaceful, and people just kind of split countries and no bloodshed, no violence. So then seeing like all these countries where the path was very different also made you wonder, like, what is it that in a way we did right, no? And then from there, of course, I was already mentioning at the beginning that I started like working on indigenous people through the broader work on self-determination as such, and then I was taken from there to the interest in like, okay, what does self-determination look like in the case of indigenous people in Latin America, which is very different to the self-determination groups that we know from Europe, and it has generated a lot of very interesting conversations, not only among academics, but particularly among academics, in the sense of, what is the exact content of self-determination. And sometimes when you look at these international treaties on the rights of indigenous people, like they precisely include this right to self-determination, and then some countries were terrified of implementing them because, like, what if we ratify this and it will actually, cause secession or something like that. But so it was very difficult and very important also academic exercise to actually, distinguish between self-determination as it's usually perceived, for instance, in the European context, and then in the context of other countries where the experience might be much different, and where the demand is really more about non-domination by the state of the indigenous people, rather than of like completely separating ourselves and creating our own unit. That's another thing, right? That even like, and now again, I don't want to be speaking on behalf of indigenous people, but my understanding from a lot of the things that I have heard in my fieldwork is that like many indigenous people don't even really believe in the idea of a state. Like for them, it's not like, you know, it's a very European kind of term that we tend to impose on them, right? That for them really it's like they think more in terms of the community, right? The kind of space that they live in, and they don't like really bother with these like abstractions of like this construct of, and which is also something that really shows you to what extent the nation states that we have nowadays really are just a construct of ours, right? So yeah, I would perhaps just leave it there, because from there we could go like many different places.
Yeah, it's strange to impose a national identity on anarcho-syndicalists. You know, it's just like it's but no, thank you so much. It's really been a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Owen. It was a pleasure to be here.